The man in the mirror. Lisa had always been skeptical about ghost stories. She wasn't the kind of person to believe in haunted houses, cursed objects, or things that go bump in the night. But that was before she moved into her new apartment. It was a cozy one-bedroom unit on the third floor of an old building in the city. The place had a certain charm, despite the creaky wooden floors and outdated wallpaper. The previous tenant had left behind only one thing: a massive antique mirror with an ornate wooden frame, carved with intricate floral patterns. It leaned against the wall in her bedroom, too heavy to move. Lisa didn't think much of it at first. In fact, she liked the way it made the small space feel bigger, but it wasn't long before she started noticing strange things. The first incident happened late one night. She was brushing her hair before bed when, out of the corner of her eye, she saw something move in the mirror. A shadow, quick and fleeting. She turned around immediately. Nothing was there. She laughed at herself. Just my imagination. But the feeling of unease stayed with her. A few nights later, as she was getting ready for bed, she glanced at the mirror. That's when she saw it. Her reflection was smiling, but Lisa wasn't. Her breath caught in her throat as she stood frozen, staring at the mirror. She rubbed her eyes, blinked hard. When she looked again, the reflection was normal. She tried to convince herself it was exhaustion, a trick of the dim lighting. But deep down, something felt wrong. The following night, it happened again. This time, the reflection didn't just smile, it moved, raising a hand, waving at her. Lisa stumbled backward, her heart pounding in her chest. The reflection wasn't copying her movements. It was independent, as if something inside the mirror was alive. She didn't sleep that night. By morning, she made a decision. She grabbed an old bed sheet and threw it over the mirror, covering it completely. Out of sight, out of mind. But at 3 a.m., she woke up to a sound, a soft, dragging noise. Her heart pounded as she sat up in bed, her breath shallow. The room was dark except for the faint glow of the streetlight filtering through the curtains. The sound came again, a slow, deliberate slide. She didn't want to look, but her eyes betrayed her, shifting toward the corner of the room. The bedsheet was on the floor, and in the mirror, her reflection was still there, grinning widely. But she wasn't standing, she was still in bed, yet the reflection was waving at her again. Then slowly it took a step forward. Lisa screamed. The whispering walls. Jake had been driving for hours. His eyes burned from exhaustion, his limbs heavy with fatigue. He had underestimated how far his road trip would take him, and now he was stuck on a deserted highway with no sign of a proper town in sight. Then, as if answering his silent prayers, he spotted a flickering neon sign in the distance. A motel. It was the only sign of civilization for miles. The place looked old, too old, like it had been built decades ago and forgotten. The parking lot was empty except for a single car covered in dust, as if it hadn't moved in years. Jake hesitated, but exhaustion won. He pulled into the lot, parked, and stepped into the small front office. An old man sat behind the counter, staring blankly at a static-filled television. He looked up as Jake entered, his eyes dull and unreadable. "Need a room?" the man asked, his voice rough. "Yeah, just for the night." The old man reached under the desk and pulled out a rusted key with a large, tarnished tag. "Room 306, he said, sliding the key across the counter. "Don't mind the sounds at night." Jake frowned. "What sounds?" The old man just shook his head, eyes drifting back to the static screen. Too tired to question it, Jake grabbed the key and made his way to the room. The hallway smelled of dust and something stale, like mildew trapped in the carpets for years. His room was basic: a bed, a nightstand, a small TV, and a bathroom. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, faded yellow with age. He tossed his bag onto the chair and collapsed onto the bed, sighing in relief. Then he heard it, a whisper, faint, almost indistinguishable from the wind. Jake sat up, his heart suddenly alert despite his exhaustion. He listened. The air conditioner hummed softly. Outside, the neon sign buzzed. But then, a voice, software faint, coming from inside the walls. Jake's breath caught. He pressed his ear against the wallpaper, his skin prickling with cold sweat. The whispering was clearer now, just beneath the surface. "He's here." Jake yanked his head back, his pulse hammering in his ears. He looked around the room, his mind racing. The motel was old. Maybe the walls were thin. Maybe it was a guest in the next room. Trying to ignore the unease curling in his stomach, he switched off the light and lay back down. But the whispers didn't stop. He doesn't know. Jake sat up again, his breath shallow. He doesn't know. It was right behind the wall, right next to him. The whispering grew louder, overlapping voices now. It sounded like a group of people, murmuring just beyond his reach. His skin crawled. Then, Jake. His name. The whispers knew his name. A chill shot through him, ice-cold fear clawing at his spine. He jumped out of bed and grabbed his keys. He needed to leave. As he turned toward the door, the TV flickered to life. Static filled the screen. Jake stared, and then, through the distorted fuzz, an image appeared. A grainy, black and white security camera feed. It showed a man lying in his bed, sleeping. But Jake was awake. His heart pounded. He looked at the bed. It was empty. He looked back at the screen. The man was now sitting up, staring directly at the camera. Jake bolted. He grabbed his bag and yanked the door open, running down the hallway. The front desk was empty, the old man gone. He didn't care. He got in his car, jammed the keys into the ignition, and sped off without looking back. The next morning, he stopped at a gas station miles away. He told the cashier about the motel, asked if he had heard of it. The man's expression darkened. "That place?" the cashier said. "It's been abandoned for years." Jake shook his head. "No, I stayed there last night. Room 306. The cashier paled. 306 was the room where they found a guy dead in his sleep. No wounds, no sign of struggle. Just gone. Jake's blood turned to ice. "What was his name?" he whispered. The cashier hesitated. Then in a quiet voice he said, "Jake." The third set of footsteps. Anna and her brother Ben had always loved hiking. They grew up exploring trails, climbing rocks, and getting lost in forests only to find their way back. It was their thing, an unspoken tradition. So when Ben suggested they take a weekend hiking trip to a remote trail he had read about, Anna didn't hesitate. The place was supposed to be beautiful, untouched wilderness, tall trees, and a lake so clear you could see straight to the bottom. They arrived in the late afternoon, the sun casting golden light through the trees. The air smelled of damp earth and pine, and the only sounds were birdsong and the occasional rustling of leaves. The hike started out peaceful. They walked side by side, chatting, their boots crunching over dry leaves. Then about an hour in, Anna noticed something strange. A third set of footsteps. She thought she had imagined it at first, but as they walked, the sound remained. A soft, deliberate crunching in the leaves behind them. Ben must have noticed it too because he stopped suddenly, glancing over his shoulder. "You hear that?" he asked, his voice low. Anna nodded, swallowing hard. "Yeah." They turned, scanning the trees. Nothing. Just the long stretch of the empty trail, dappled with evening light. "Maybe it's an animal," Ben suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. They kept walking. The footsteps followed. This time when they stopped, the footsteps didn't. Anna's stomach twisted. There was someone, something following them. Ben turned sharply. "Who's there?" Silence. Then a whisper, barely audible through the trees. "Keep walking." A chill ran through Anna's body. The voice was soft, almost playful, but there was something wrong about it. It wasn't close. It wasn't far. It was just there, everywhere. Ben grabbed her arm. "Let's go!" They picked up their pace. The sun was setting fast now, shadows stretching across the trail. Anna's heart pounded in her chest. Crunch, crunch, crunch. The footsteps followed, faster now, keeping up. The whisper came again, closer. "Don't turn around." Anna's breathing hitched. Ben whispered, "Run!" They bolted. The forest blurred past them as they sprinted down the trail, their legs burning, lungs gasping for air. But no matter how fast they ran, the third set of footsteps stayed right behind them. Then up ahead, their car. Anna fumbled for the keys in her pocket, nearly dropping them as she yanked open the door. Ben dove into the passenger seat. They locked the doors, their chests heaving. Silence. Anna gripped the steering wheel, her hands trembling. She turned to Ben, her throat dry. "Did you?" He nodded. "Yeah, I heard it." Slowly, cautiously, Anna glanced back at the trail. A tall, shadowy figure stood just at the edge of the trees, watching them, not moving, just staring. Ben cursed under his breath. "Drive, now!" Anna didn't need to be told twice. She slammed the car into gear, tires kicking up dust as they sped away. Neither of them spoke for a long time. When they finally reached the main road, Anna dared to glance at the rearview mirror. The forest had long disappeared into the distance. But in the reflection, sitting in the back seat, a shadow still watching. The phone that rang at 3 a.m. The first time it happened, Emily thought she was dreaming. The sharp, jarring ring of her phone cut through the stillness of the night, startling her awake. Groggy, she reached for her phone, squinting at the bright screen. Incoming call. David. Her heart skipped a beat. David, her husband, was lying right next to her, his slow, steady breathing filling the quiet bedroom. His phone was on the nightstand, untouched, but his name was on her screen, calling her. She hesitated before answering. "Hello?" For a moment there was nothing but static, then faintly a voice, weak, trembling. "Emily?" It was David's voice. She turned her head, her pulse hammering. David was still fast asleep beside her. "Something's wrong." The voice on the phone cracked, fading in and out. "I need help." A chill crept up her spine. "David?" she whispered. "Please, don't let me in." The call cut off. Emily sat frozen, phone clutched in her hand. She stared at the screen, expecting to see a missed call notification. But there was nothing, no record of the call. Her chest tightened. The room was silent again. The only sound was the low hum of the heater and David's steady breathing. Then, a knock at the front door, software slow. She sucked in a sharp breath. David stirred beside her, groaning as he turned. "What's wrong?" he mumbled sleepily. Emily swallowed hard, her voice barely a whisper. "Someone's at the door." David frowned, sitting up. He rubbed his eyes, then glanced at the clock. 3:07 a.m. "Who the hell?" he muttered, already swinging his legs over the side of the bed. The knock came again, a little louder this time. Emily grabbed his arm. "Wait!" David turned to her, confused. "What?" Her fingers tightened around his wrist. "Don't open it." His brows furrowed. "Why?" She couldn't explain, not without sounding crazy, but something in her voice made him hesitate. Another knock, this time slow and deliberate. David sighed. "It's probably just a neighbor or something." He pulled away from her grip and got out of bed. Emily's heart pounded. She watched as he moved toward the door, his bare feet making soft thuds against the wooden floor. He flicked on the hallway light. The warm glow spilled toward the front entrance. He reached for the doorknob. "David, don't!" she cried, scrambling out of bed. But he had already pulled the door open. A gust of cold night air rushed in. The porch light flickered. Emily stopped in her tracks. The doorway was empty. No one was there. David stepped out onto the porch, looking around. "Hello?" His voice echoed into the darkness. Nothing. Just the rustling of trees in the cold wind. He stepped back inside, shutting the door behind him. "Weird," he muttered. "Maybe some kid messing around." Emily couldn't shake the unease curling in her stomach. She turned to check the door's peephole and felt her blood freeze. Outside, standing directly in front of the door, was a man, but not just any man. It was David. Her husband's face stared back at her, pale and expressionless. His eyes were vacant, his lips moving in a slow, soundless whisper. A muffled voice crackled in her ears. "Emily, please, don't let me in." A hand clamped down on her shoulder. She whirled around. David was right behind her, frowning. "Emily, what's wrong?" Her breath hitched. Her gaze flickered back to the peephole. The figure outside was gone. The night was empty again. She took a step back, heart pounding. David sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Come on, let's go back to bed." Emily didn't move. Somehow, she wasn't sure if the man standing beside her was really her husband. The doll that moved. When Olivia's grandmother passed away, she inherited a box of old belongings: lace gloves, silver hairpins, delicate porcelain teacups. Among them was a doll. It was old, clearly handmade, with finely painted blue eyes and jet black curls. It wore a frilly white dress, yellowed with age, and a small gold locket around its tiny porcelain neck. Olivia never liked dolls, but she kept it anyway. She placed it on a shelf in her bedroom, tucked between old books. Out of sight, out of mind. That night she woke with a strange feeling, like she wasn't alone. Moonlight filtered through her curtains, casting shadows on the floor. Her room was silent, but something felt wrong. Her gaze drifted toward the bookshelf. The doll wasn't facing forward anymore. It was turned toward her. She sat up, heart pounding. Had she placed it that way? No, she was sure it had been facing straight ahead. Shaking off the unease, she got up and turned it back. Just her imagination, she told herself. The next night it happened again. This time it wasn't just turned toward her. It was closer. It had moved from the shelf to her nightstand. Olivia felt a chill crawl up her spine. She didn't remember touching it. She didn't remember moving it. She swallowed hard, picked it up, and shoved it back onto the shelf. The following morning, when she woke up, the doll was sitting on her bed. That was enough. She stuffed it into a wooden box, locked it shut, and carried it up to the attic. She placed it in the farthest corner, beneath a pile of old blankets. She shut the attic door, exhaled, and went back to bed. At 3 a.m., she woke to a soft sound. Tap, tap, tap. Something was knocking. She turned toward her bedroom door, pulse quickening. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the attic. Olivia sat frozen, barely breathing. Tap, tap, tap. The knocking grew more insistent. Then, a creak. The attic door was opening. She bolted upright, her breath caught in her throat. The air was thick, heavy. The house was silent, but she knew she wasn't alone. Slowly, she turned her head toward the foot of her bed. Her stomach dropped. The attic door was wide open, and sitting right there, on the floor of her bedroom, was the doll, facing her, locket open, and its tiny porcelain lips, smiling. The wrong passenger Mark had been driving for hours. The road stretched endlessly before him, a lonely ribbon of asphalt cutting through miles of empty countryside. His headlights carved a path through the darkness, illuminating only the occasional road sign or gnarled tree. The night air was heavy, and exhaustion tugged at his eyelids. Then in the distance, he saw her, a lone figure standing by the roadside. She was barefoot, her long white dress billowing slightly in the night breeze. Her dark hair hung in tangled strands around her face, which was pale, too pale. Mark's hands tightened on the wheel. A hitchhiker? Out here at this hour? He hesitated, but as he passed her, something in his gut twisted. She looked lost, abandoned. With a sigh, he slowed down and pulled over. Rolling down the window, he called out, "Hey, do you need a ride?" The woman didn't answer. She simply walked forward, moving with an eerie grace, and slid into the back seat without a word. Mark shivered. She smelled faintly of damp earth. He cleared his throat. "Where are you headed?" Silence. He glanced in the rearview mirror. She was sitting rigidly, staring straight ahead, her face barely visible in the dim glow of the dashboard lights. The road stretched on, endless and empty. Mark's discomfort deepened. "Do you live around here?" He tried again. The woman's lips parted slightly. He strained to hear her response. A whisper, faint, incomprehensible. Mark turned his head slightly. "Sorry, what did you—" The car jerked violently as his tires skidded against the road. His pulse hammered as he gripped the wheel, steadying the vehicle. He exhaled sharply. "Damn. Sorry, the road's slick tonight." No response. Something felt wrong. A slow, creeping sensation crawled up his spine. He glanced in the rearview mirror again, his breath caught in his throat. The woman was gone. The seat was empty. His hands trembled on the wheel, his foot pressed instinctively against the brake. He turned his head fully toward the back seat. Nothing, but his car still smelled of damp earth. Mark swallowed hard, trying to steady his breathing. His mind raced for an explanation. Maybe she had never been there. Maybe he was more tired than he thought. But as he turned back to the road, a whisper right in his ear. "Don't stop the car!" Mark's scream choked in his throat. His headlights flickered, and in the mirror, she was sitting beside him now, her face inches from his, her hollow eyes staring, her lips barely moving as she whispered, "Keep driving." The house that called her name. Sophie had always been drawn to old houses. There was something about their peeling wallpaper, creaking floors, and forgotten stories that fascinated her. So when she found an abandoned Victorian house listed for rent at a ridiculously low price, she jumped at the opportunity. The landlord was an older man with tired eyes. He handed her the keys without much conversation, though his fingers lingered for a moment before letting go. "Are you sure you want to stay here?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sophie laughed. "Of course, it's beautiful." He hesitated before nodding. Just don't go downstairs at night." She frowned. "Why?" But he didn't answer. The first night was peaceful. The air smelled of dust and age, but she didn't mind. She curled up in bed, listening to the wind whisper through the cracked windows. At exactly 3:12 a.m., she woke up. At first, she wasn't sure why. Then she heard it. A whisper. Faint, almost indistinguishable, but unmistakable. "Sophie!" Her blood ran cold. She held her breath, straining to listen. Maybe she had imagined it. Maybe it was just the wind. Then, "Sophie, come downstairs." Her stomach twisted. She pulled the blanket tighter around herself, heart hammering. The voice had come from the living room, but she was alone. The old wooden floor creaked as if someone was shifting their weight. Her fingers clenched around the blanket. Number she wasn't going to play into her own fears. She reached for her phone, illuminating the screen. 3:14 a.m. When she looked up, the bedroom door was slightly open. It had been closed when she went to bed. Her breath hitched. Then, the sound of something dragging across the floor downstairs. Sophie shut her eyes, forcing herself to stay still. Minutes passed. Silence. Finally, she willed herself to look toward the door again. It was wide open now, her stomach clenched. Then just outside her doorway, a shadow moved. Sophie barely had time to react before the voice whispered again, so close it felt like it was brushing against her skin. "Welcome home," she screamed. The next morning, she packed her bags and left. She didn't tell the landlord why. She didn't have to. He just nodded. As she drove away, she glanced in the rearview mirror at the house. The upstairs window, her bedroom, was open, and in the darkness behind the glass, something was watching her leave. The shadow in the closet. Nathan had always been afraid of his closet. As a child, he would beg his parents to check inside before bedtime, convinced that something was hiding in the shadows. They would always sigh, open the doors, show him the empty space, and kiss him goodnight. But no matter how tightly he shut the door before sleeping, he would always wake up to find it slightly open. His parents told him it was just the old house settling, that sometimes doors shifted because of the draft. But Nathan knew better. Something was in there, watching, waiting. Years passed, and eventually Nathan grew up. The fear never fully left him, but he convinced himself it was childish, just his imagination. At 18, he moved into his first apartment. It was small, but it was his. The very first night, as he unpacked, he hesitated in front of the closet. The door was slightly ajar. An old familiar dread crept up his spine. Shaking his head, he muttered, "Not this again." He grabbed a chair and wedged it under the handle. There, problem solved. That night, as he lay in bed, a strange sense of unease settled over him. The apartment was silent, too silent. Then, thump. Nathan's eyes snapped open. A single deliberate knock from inside the closet. His throat tightened. Number. He must have imagined it. He turned over, pulling the blanket higher. Thump. Thump. This time it was louder. Nathan's breath hitched. The chair was still under the handle. The door was still closed. Wasn't it? He didn't want to look. Thump. 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 His body froze. The knocking was rhythmic now, deliberate. Then, a voice, software whispers, coming from the closet. "Nathan, let me out." A chill ran through his entire body. number. He clenched his fists, forcing himself to stay still. Maybe if he ignored it, it would go away. Minutes passed. Silence. His muscles relaxed just slightly. Maybe it was just his mind playing tricks. The chair moved, not fell, not toppled, moved, slowly. Scraping against the wooden floor, Nathan bolted upright. His heart pounded so loudly it drowned out everything else. Then, the closet door creaked open. Just an inch. A sliver of darkness. Something shifted inside. Nathan couldn't breathe. Then, the whisper again, so close it felt like it was breathing against his ear. "You should have never left me behind." Nathan didn't scream. He couldn't, because as his eyes adjusted to the darkness, he saw it. Tall, gaunt, its twisted, too long fingers curling around the doorframe, and its face, no eyes, just a gaping black hole where its mouth should have been, grinning. Nathan never stayed in that apartment again. The guest who never left, Olivia, found the apartment by chance. It was cheap in a decent neighborhood and had a landlord who seemed desperate to rent it out. Too desperate. But Olivia wasn't in a position to be picky. She was fresh out of college, barely making enough money to afford rent, and the idea of her own place was too tempting to resist. The landlord handed her the keys and hesitated before saying, "The last tenant left suddenly, but don't worry, everything's fine now." Olivia frowned. Left suddenly? That was vague. But again, she needed the apartment. She pushed her doubts aside and moved in the next day. The first night was uneventful. The apartment smelled musty, but nothing out of the ordinary. Until 2 a.m. A noise woke her. Footsteps, software bare, moving slowly across the wooden floor. She held her breath, listening. She lived alone. The footsteps stopped outside her bedroom door. Then knock, knock, knock. 3 slow, deliberate taps. Her body went rigid. She reached for her phone, her fingers trembling. But then, silence. For a long time, she didn't move, didn't even breathe. She waited, listening to the stillness. Eventually, she convinced herself she had imagined it. Maybe it was the pipes, or a neighbor moving around. By morning, she felt silly for being so scared, until she saw the footprints, muddy, bare, leading from the front door to her bedroom. Her stomach turned. She double-checked the locks. They were still bolted. The windows? Locked. There was no way someone could have come inside. Right? The next night, she stayed awake, determined to prove to herself it was just her imagination. She kept all the lights on, her phone in hand, and waited. 2 a.m. The footsteps came again. Slow, dragging, moving toward her door. Knock, knock, knock. Olivia's breath came in short, sharp gasps. She had to look. Swallowing her fear, she forced herself to reach for the doorknob, her fingers trembling. She yanked the door open. Nothing. The hallway was empty, but the footprints were there, still wet. And this time, they led back to the closet. Something inside her screamed, "Don't open it," but her body moved on its own. Her fingers wrapped around the handle. Slowly, she pulled it open. Inside, the closet was empty, except for a single object sitting in the darkness. A phone, not hers. It was an old flip phone, covered in dust. She picked it up, her hands shaking, and flipped it open. One unread message, from an unknown number. The text read, "Why are you in my apartment?" The room suddenly felt wrong, cold, heavy, suffocating, and then her phone buzzed. A new text, from her number, but she hadn't sent anything. She opened the message. "I never left." Behind her, the closet door slammed shut. She didn't stay another night. The face in the window, Jake had always dreamed of living somewhere quiet. After years in the city, surrounded by constant noise and light pollution, he was ready for a change. So when he found a small house in the countryside at an unbelievably low price, he didn't think twice. The real estate agent was eager to sell. The last owner left in a hurry, she told him, avoiding his eyes. But Jake didn't care. The house was charming, nestled among the trees, with a big front porch and a garden that needed some love. It was perfect. At first, the first few nights were peaceful. Jake spent his days fixing up the house, painting, and clearing out the overgrown weeds. He left the windows open to let in the fresh country air. And then one night, as he was locking up, he glanced out the window and saw it, a face, pale, hollow-eyed, pressed against the glass. Jake's breath hitched. His mind scrambled for logic. Maybe a trick of the moonlight? Maybe a lost traveler? He flipped on the porch light. The face was gone. His heart pounded as he stepped outside. There was no one there. No footprints in the dirt. No sign that anyone had been standing at the window at all. Just the empty night. He went to bed uneasy. A week passed. Jake told himself it was just his imagination, that he was adjusting to the quiet, that maybe his city-raised mind was playing tricks on him. Then it happened again. This time he was brushing his teeth, standing at the bathroom mirror. He leaned down to spit, and when he looked up, the face was in the reflection, right behind him. Jake spun around, heart slamming against his ribs. The bathroom was empty, but when he turned back to the mirror, his own reflection looked distorted, twisted, like something was watching him through his own eyes. That night, sleep was impossible. 3 a.m. Jake jolted awake. A sound had pulled him from his sleep, a faint, slow tapping. Tap, 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 from the window. His body froze, paralyzed in fear. The air in the room felt thick, suffocating. The tapping continued. Jake forced himself to turn his head and saw it again. The face, inside the house. Not outside the window this time. Inside. It was staring at him from across the darkened room, its mouth stretched into an unnatural grin. Jake's breath came in short, panicked gasps. He couldn't move, couldn't scream. And then it moved, fast. Jake bolted. He didn't stop, didn't grab his things, didn't even lock the door behind him. He just ran. The next morning he returned with the police. The house was exactly how he had left it. Nothing was out of place, except for one thing. On the bedroom window on the inside, there was a single, smudged handprint. Jake never stepped foot inside that house again.